It was not a planned moment, not a press release, but it communicated something powerful, even though it was a moment that was never intended to happen. I mean, he actually asked to stop filming at that point because he thought he should regain composure before he makes this. Political leaders in many parts of the world, they become political leaders primarily because they can talk. I think our political leaders still primarily become political leaders because they can think. Singaporeans sometimes think of government as this one monolithic, strategically.
Which is why today we're joined by Sheila Pakir, who has spent years in the world of comms, with stints across the communications arm of the Singapore government and the Pioneer Generation Office, where she coordinated outreach efforts on national healthcare policies. She now runs her own consultancy, Kaye Consulting, where she helps leaders understand the true craft of communications. So welcome, Sheila.
Hi, Ken Jong. Thank you. I just want to caveat that I did spend some time in communication when I was in government, but actually most of my time was spent in policy. But the work of government is such that even in policy, actually a lot of the thinking goes into communicating it with the public. How are we going to talk to the citizenry about it and gain acceptance for it? So I think you're right that communication kind of permeated my whole government career. But there are definitely people who have spent much more time in government communication specifically than me. But I'll do what I can to help today.
No, of course. But I think for the audience as well, I think the reason why we wanted to get Sheila on for the conversation is really that you have very well thought out perspectives and the whole breadth of experience when it comes to comms. So I think to my definition of what government comms is, like, do you have anything to add to that? And why do you think that is important?
I really love that you identified that moment of anguish of our first Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew crying at the point of separation as government comms. Because actually I think a lot of people, including maybe himself at that time, would not have thought of it that way. It was not a planned moment. It was not a press release. But it communicated something powerful, even though it was a moment that was never intended to happen. I mean, he actually asked to stop filming at that point because he thought he should regain composure before he makes this announcement. I think that we, sometimes in Singapore, because and in the civil service, we really think our policies through from a very technical lens sometimes, right? So we are, and I think this is a good thing. We really do evidence-based policymaking. We are, really trying to find the best solution for a problem. We're trying to find the best long-term solution for a problem. And there are so many intellectual aspects of doing this work. And when we end up wanting to communicate that to the public, we want to communicate all the thinking that went into it as well. Like, this is why we think this is good for the long-term future. This is why we think that this is the best solution for it now. And there's nothing wrong with that. But in a sense, we start thinking of government comms as informing the people of these technical details or the things. This is how it will affect you. And sometimes we forget that actually there is a big emotional aspect. The thing about that moment, though, is that it couldn't have been planned. It would have not worked if it was planned. I hope that we'll never have a leader who cynically is like, I need to cry on screen in order to have this moment. Although I think there are leaders in other countries and in other settings that do that, surely, right? Celebrities too, surely. TikTok influencers, surely. I hope we never come to a point where that is the case for us.
For sure.
So the thing about government comms is it is quite authentic to the type of government we have, but we think of it as informing people of, giving them information rather than communicating a heartfelt narrative.
So that's really cool. And I think maybe to give people a lay of the land, how do you think that government comms has evolved over the years? Because I think when you look at previous generations, like what you mentioned, there was maybe a different kind of comms that was done. Whereas now, citizenry has evolved. So how do you think it has evolved?
What do you mean by different kind of comms?
I would say that, let's say for instance, Lee Kuan Yew, when he pioneered the idea of what National Day really is, right? Where you speak in front of people and you share major policies. And this was his preferred way of articulating what the government of the day is actually doing, which is the National Day rally, which even it perpetuates to today, whereby a lot of the major policies are announced on National Day together with like the budget, right?
Because what I'm saying to you is as important as your response to what I'm saying to you. And it's going on live.
So there are definitely defining moments within a calendar year that the government coordinates like comms around. But that is something in which the reason why National Day worked so well for Lee Kuan Yew was because he was such a good orator. And which is why when Goh Chok Tong became the Prime Minister afterwards, he was very nervous about his first National Day.
friends and fellow citizens. It is indeed a great privilege for me to be given the opportunity to speak to you tonight.
And I think that who the leaders are, in terms of how charismatic they are, how good of orator they are, it informs the government comms a lot. Because if you don't have Lee Kuan Yew who is as good of orator, you need to change how you actually perform government comms. Which is why I would love to hear your perspective on how you think it has evolved. I mean, I think that this is how I see a little, but...
No, it's an interesting question. I mean, I didn't live through the Lee Kuan Yew era, so I guess what we have are the snippets and the very memorable snippets that we have from many of his major speeches. I think that, well, this is not directly related to your question, but it brings to mind something I heard recently, actually on another podcast. It was an interview with Daniel Kahneman, who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow. He was talking about how cognitive biases. And one very common cognitive bias in almost everybody is we tend to have, or at least the people that are studied, which maybe might have a Western lean, but people tend to prefer leaders who are intuitive and overconfident or project a great amount of confidence. And in fact, people in studies view leaders who are overly deliberative with suspicion because, in the back of your mind, you're wondering, do they, maybe they don't know what they're doing and that's why they're deliberating so much. When I listened to this, I was reflecting on Singapore and I felt a deep sense of gratitude that I might be wrong, touch wood, things might change, but I think our electorate, the way it is now, has largely managed to avoid that cognitive trap. I think it's natural that, when someone speaks with a great deal of confidence, you tend to trust them, which is why people tend to trust AI a lot more than we should. When it hallucinates with such confidence that we start to believe it because that's how we're wired. But I think in Singapore, we've seen the electorate appreciate a deliberative leader. I mean, to an extent, right? You still need to be able to come up with confidence and say certain things confidently. But I think the electorate doesn't mind that we have leaders who deliberate and who think. And we prize that. We want our leader to be really smart and we want our leader to be really thoughtful and careful even as they are confident leaders. I think that the experience with COVID actually is a great example of this. So COVID was such a dynamic situation. Every country was figuring out how to talk about it. There was so much we didn't know about the disease. I mean, things that we know today were completely out of left field back when we were learning about it. But there are, I remember I think CNA published this, I think it was a Pew Research study done across something like 15 or 20 countries, I think 25,000 respondents or something. And it was ranking all these countries based on what respondents from the country, so citizens said in terms of how the government handled COVID. And I mean, Singapore just came out way ahead of all the countries polled. Most countries said that they felt that their country was less united after COVID. And in Singapore, we said, majority of us were like, no, we're actually much more united. The majority of countries felt like the citizens felt that the governments had not handled it well, but most citizens in Singapore felt like the government had handled it well. And I think a lot of that has to do with the MTF. So we did something we don't usually do. So like you said, usually our government communications, our major communications are confined to, National Day rally, the budget speech, really big, parliamentary debates, like that. But in this case, we saw it was a crisis. And I think the government recognized that we needed to err on the side of over-communicating, right? And so this MTF, I'm sure you remember, I remember, like, you tune in, you wait for it to start. And it was just a panel of political leaders telling us what they knew and telling us what they thought we should do. And what I appreciated about the MTF is even as the situation was changing and it was dynamic, they were trying to be transparent. And I think Singaporeans could feel that they were trying to be transparent. They're not trying to hide the number of deaths. I mean, we used to get those text messages every day, right? With like the number of cases, the number of deaths. And so there was, as near as complete transparency as we could have asked for. They were, kind of summarizing the medical findings of the day. There was a doctor on the panel as well. And they were trying to frame it for Singaporeans and say, this is what we're seeing from our level, like where we are dealing with this every day and we're talking to all the experts every day. This is what we're seeing and this is, what you need to know about it. Because of that, I feel like a lot of Singaporeans, compared to, say, in some other developed countries, I think more Singaporeans were on board with things like vaccination, mask wearing, because we understood the rationale. It had been explained to us and in a way that was, transparent and authentic. And it didn't feel like they were trying to hide anything from us. So I think that was a masterclass in communication, right? Using communication to build that trust, especially in a time of crisis. Obviously, you can't do that all the time. If we had an MTF every single week on the issue of the day, people would probably stop tuning in, right? I mean, as it is, how many Singaporeans watch NDR in full? I'm not sure. I mean, probably clips of it, right? You read the news coverage of it maybe, but how many actually watch it in full? You know, this 2-3 hour thing? I'm not sure. How many people watch the budget debate in full? How many people tune in to watch like parliamentary debates where a lot of these types of things are said? So we can't, it doesn't always work. Crisis is a unique time, but that was a really good example of how constant communication, transparent communication, I think was fundamental to creating the sense of trust that people had in the government. Such that even when there were missteps, and every government had missteps, they were much more prepared to forgive and say, you know, I do think they were trying their best because they told us about it as they were going along. So, sorry, actually, what was the question I'm trying to answer?
I think how government comms has evolved.
I think you're right. We had with our first PM, he was a natural orator, very inspirational, could really bring people along. So I think we had, you know, our first PM, you're right, very strong orator, very inspirational, could really bring people along. And you're right, like how many Lee Kuan Yews do we get in
the world,
in the world and in each generation? It's very hard to find someone like that again. And I think he was what we needed at that time. You know, I'm not 100% confident someone who's like that would be what we need today. It may be the case, but it may also not be the case because we're facing a different set of circumstances. But I think even though we have political leaders who, you know, unlike in other parts of the world, political leaders in many parts of the world, they become political leaders primarily because they can talk. I think our political leaders still primarily become political leaders because they can think and do, right? I think that's what is still looked for. But all because of that, it doesn't mean that they can't communicate well, right? So I think the MTF was a good example of that. I mean, it's a panel of very bureaucratic political leaders, but they spoke honestly and from the heart, and you could see the tiredness on their face, right? And that communicates as well. Like all of that context also communicates. So I think we can still do a good job if we want to.
Which is why I'd love to get into this a bit more. I think on your other podcast, on I think Majula podcast, you talk about, I'm getting this wrong as in like what the name is. I think the Bolivian student government experiment. And I think it's interesting because I think earlier you talked about how the nature of people predisposes them to certain types of leaders. And maybe you can speak a bit more about, I guess, how human psychology intersects with what kind of communication styles people naturally look for.
Repeat that last one?
Like how communication styles intersect with, I think, the psychology of what people actually look for.
So it's unfortunate because, you know, as we are seeing all around the world, our cognitive wiring doesn't necessarily lend us to successful political outcomes, right? I was just at a talk where one thing that was being discussed was how politically in many advanced Western liberal democracies, we're seeing the collapse of the center. Right? Increasingly, political parties are being pushed to fringes, pushed to the extremes. And anyone who's in the center can't really gain as much influence as if they were on either side. And I think the reason for that is because anger and outrage are some of the most effective and sticky ways to create engagement. That's why our social media algorithms are all about outrage farming. The way they keep you doom scrolling is by serving you things that they know will trigger you or like will get you all heated up. And you know, you like and you comment and then you share it with friends because outrage is just we're wired to work that way, right? Outrage is a really, really, really strong engagement tool. I really worry I really worry about the possibility of that coming to Singapore one day, and we're not going to be immune either. And I think the way to try to deal with that is to use communication to consistently build trust and to consistently be transparent with the electorate so that when someone tries to, you know, create outrage here, there is a base foundation of trust that they have to try to deal with. I think that has disappeared in many of the Western democracies that we're seeing today. In Singapore, I think the way, you know, we have largely, I think, still managed to hold the center together. Like if you look at our policies, they're not really informed by leftist or rightist ideology. On some things, we lean what Western democracies would call quite left, and on other things we lean quite right. Pragmatism, right, is our ideology, we always say. And I think because we've been consistent about that, I feel like Singaporeans are also very pragmatic. I was talking to a foreign businessman the other day, and he was like, no, Singaporeans are very pragmatic in how they choose what they want to spend their money on and things like that. And I think it comes through in our culture as well. So I think, I hope that because we have this, I dare say, quite a sophisticated electorate. I mean, we have high levels of education. I think that helps. We have high levels of engagement with news, with world affairs. As a small country, we've always been interested in what's happening in the world, more so than, say, many citizens in large countries never really have to think about what's happening in the rest of the world. We've always had to. We feel the impact of things from geopolitical events, from global events. So I think we have, on average, a more... I feel so weird, like you praise something and then you worry that something bad will happen, right? It's a very Asian thing. But I feel like we do have quite a sophisticated electorate that's also quite pragmatic. And so I really hope that we'll be able to resist this bias towards, the outrage farming that we're seeing in the world.
And I think on this point, maybe you could share a bit more for the audience what the Bolivian student government experiment is.
I need to try to remember. It was a long time ago that I heard about this, but essentially, they had an experiment where I think for 1 or 2 cycles, they, instead of allowing students to run for student government in the traditional way, which is like through campaigning and making speeches and winning votes that way, they allowed everyone who was interested in being a part of student government to come forward and put their name in a hat. Essentially, they shook the hat and then they drew out the names, and that was the student government. And I think the journalists or the researchers who were there were quite skeptical at first because they met the new student government. And it's like, a bunch of, like, some were introverts, some were like, didn't seem super confident. People who would never have won an election, right? Because they're not brash, they're not loud, they're not overly confident. And so the journalists left feeling a bit like, I'm not sure this will work out because I'm not sure of the capability level of the student government. But when they came back a year later, they found that it had been one of the most effective student governments in the history of the school or something like that, right? And also, like, the satisfaction rating among the students was very, very high. And I just thought that was an interesting kind of thought experiment. Obviously, it would be difficult to do that in a real country where the stakes are much higher and much realer. But essentially, the system encouraged people who were interested in serving but not necessarily interested in limelight to step forward. And I think that was important. I think that's what we want. Everyone wants in a democratic leader. You want someone to step forward who's interested in serving and not in it for themselves. But with, if you look at liberal democratic systems, Western democratic systems, you have to at least not hate the limelight. You actually thrive if you enjoy the limelight because you're in the limelight. You're making speeches. You're trying to take up as much of the room for conversation as possible so that people vote for you. So the system doesn't actually create the kind of leadership that we actually want. It actually encourages us to lean into these biases and go for the person who's maybe more confident than they should be, rather than the more capable person who speaks with more caveats, with more caution. Although that is talking about government comms and how it's evolved, I think one challenge is with a sophisticated electorate. This generation of government and the last generation as well probably has to deal with more... It's harder to get things wrong because you'll get called out on it. Yes. People are discerning, they're smart, and so if you make a mistake, people do point that out. And I think one effect that has had is, so when I was in the service, which is a long time ago fairly, but I think that this feeling still permeates today, there's this pressure on yourself to get things right. So if you're going out to the public with anything, if there's a major speech happening, I mean, we try to check and recheck and triple check every single thing because we know any small detail that we miss or like something that we didn't realize would be controversial becomes controversial, then that just will create a headache. And we want to get everything perfect and everything right. I think this desire to be perfect can get in the way of effective comms. Because the most effective comms to me is authentic. And very often authenticity is not perfect. The example of Lee Kuan Yew crying on TV, it was not a perfect moment for him. Yes. He probably would have preferred not to cry at all, but his emotions overtook him, right? It was powerful because it was imperfect. I'm not saying we should try to put out imperfect stuff because again, that's not authentic. But this stress of this, like we have to get everything exactly right, and maybe even for the leader giving the speech, I have to read the speech exactly as it's written because everything was checked and everything is correct. This worry about always being perfect gets in the way of something that could be more emotive and effective sometimes. Sometimes if you just allow a leader to speak from their heart, they might get a few details wrong, right? But they're trying to convey something. And if we try to wall them up behind like double-checked and triple-checked speeches, then they will sound, more robotic or less authentic. And the sad thing is, so I had the privilege of working with some political leaders, and I could see, the difference when they speak off the cuff in a room versus when they're speaking from a podium with a speech. I mean, the level of conviction, the feelings they clearly have about the importance of service or the importance of doing this right for Singaporeans or wanting to get things right for Singaporeans, that doesn't come through as much when it's in prepared remarks. But with a sophisticated electorate, you better have prepared remarks because they will hang you out to dry if you say something wrong. So that's the difficulty there.
Do you see that this is a trend in Singapore, especially given, Singapore always compares itself, I think, to other, more developed democracies or electorates. And in some ways, as Singapore progresses and, people get more educated, do you see that this pressure increases even when you were in the civil service?
Definitely. I think that now Singaporeans have a much greater appetite for the details of why we do a policy a certain way. They want to engage on the technocratic details, right? Which used to be only the preserve of the bureaucrats. We had access to the information and then they trust us to just do the number crunching and come up with the solution that's right for them. Now, I think it's a good thing. The citizenry is much more active. There are plenty of people on podcasts, in journalism, in any kind of media, in parliament, in opposition parties. They want to engage on the tenets of the policy. And that's not a bad thing. But it does mean that we then always feel like we have to be the good student that's always really, really well prepared. And that creates stress in the service. I was reflecting the other day when thinking about how citizens feel about their government and how Singaporeans feel about our government. Having been outside of government for a while, and even when I was in government, right, but especially now being outside, you sometimes get the feeling that for some Singaporeans on some issues, it's like us versus the government, right? Like the government is doing this to us, they're taking our money or they're not giving this to us. We sometimes forget that actually any organization, company, a government, it's just people. There's no monolithic AI or something that you can say doesn't is doing things to us. It's actually just people doing their best to do their jobs. And in my time in government, I spent almost 10 years in government. It amazed me to realize this, but not once did I come across a single civil servant who I worked with who did not have their heart in the right place about wanting to do right by Singapore. It's not the sexiest place to work. And if you're a high flyer, you could probably earn more elsewhere. And you do have to deal with a lot of red tape, and even civil servants we don't like dealing with red tape. Sometimes we understand the need for it to be there, but nobody likes dealing with red tape, right? So it takes a certain type of person to really want to devote their career to the service. And every single person I met really had that heart for Singapore. They were really just trying to do their best, to think of a policy that would help the most Singaporeans, to think of a policy that would protect Singapore in the long term. And often these would be unpopular things, right? We don't want people to mess with our CPF. We don't want people to change policies on housing and make the flat I wanted to buy less affordable or the flat I want to sell less expensive. So it will always make some people unhappy, but not once. And this is incredible, right? Not once in my 10 years in the service did I meet any civil servant who didn't have the heart in the right place. And that is kind of an amazing statistic. You meet hundreds. It was just the sort of thing where if you didn't want to do right by Singapore, you would go and do something else because the pain of the job is high enough that you have to think it's a privilege to do the work in order to be willing to do the work. So civil servants aren't really allowed to come out and speak our minds about what it's like to be in the service. Now that I've left, maybe I can help to say that a bit because I'm no longer bound by those restrictions. But at the end of the day, the government is just a bunch of people trying to do the right thing. And you might disagree on what the right thing is. And that's very normal. Even within government, we really disagree on what the right thing is. But what's nice is right now, at least with the government we have, I really believe it's people still trying to do the right thing. And when I look at other countries, I'm not sure that's always the case. I think that there are pockets of people like that in every government, but very rarely is it almost all.
And I think it's interesting because Singapore is in a very unique position whereby a lot of the politicians actually come from the civil service. And because of this, I think because of the training and because of the way that the civil service prepares you, people often say that the Singapore leaders, maybe they sound more technocratic, more managerial than aspirational or like, I guess, very rah-rah, like similar to, as in nothing like, the entertainers or the comedians, that end up attaining political leadership in a lot of other countries. I'm curious, like, how do you see that affecting trust in Singapore in the long run? Because some can say that this is a very good thing, but I would love to hear, I think, your perspective about this.
I love the fact that we still live in a country where civil servants are willing to step forward to become political leaders, because I think it's it really does help. I think you need a variety. You need all kinds of people in parliament, including civil servants. But we also need people from all other sectors of society, but there needs to be that view because civil servants are trained to take a long view. That's quite rare. A lot of even business people, right, might be trained to think of like a medium-term view or short-term view to make profit or to attain profitability or whatever it is. But civil servants are in one of the few disciplines that we are trained to think really, really long term. And I think we do need some of that always in parliament. I think it comes down to, so for me, I think I've spoken about this before, but what are the foundations of trust, right? Why do people follow leaders? And, there's a whole lot of things you could list about, what creates trust. For me, it comes down to three buckets, right? So I trust you because I believe you are competent. Meaning I think you will make the right decisions. I think you will execute it well. I think you are clever and you know how to do things and you'll do them well. The second is I trust you because I think that you have integrity. Meaning that I think that you will do the right thing even when no one is looking. I think you will be honest with me. I don't think you'll lie to me. All of those things. And the third bucket is I trust you because I believe you have my best interests at heart. And this means, I believe that you'll make decisions that are right for me when you know things that I don't. I think that because we have had quite a technocratic government for a while, we really invest in demonstrating our competence and our integrity. And we're not so good at demonstrating this, we have your best interests at heart, even though actually that third one is the one I felt the most when I was in the service. Like I said, everyone I met, I felt like had Singapore's best interests at heart. But it's the one we're worst at communicating because it's a bit touchy-feely, right? And it's hard to communicate because if I tell you, oh, Ken Chong, I have your best interests at heart, like what reason do you have to believe me? But if I tell you, oh, Ken Chong, I will show up on time, I will give you the right analysis, and I will execute it properly. You can see the proof in the pudding, right? Yes. So you can say, oh, she did it before, so she'll probably do it again. So competence and integrity are a bit easier to demonstrate than care. So I think that that's something that sometimes we struggle to articulate. It actually really feels like an Asian parent dynamic, like the Asian parent who can never say I love you or I'm proud of you, but they cut fruit for you every morning and they pay your school fees and they iron your uniform and they drive you to school and they want to set you up to succeed. They really, really want to set you up to succeed. They want to give you every opportunity in life, but they'll never say I love you or I'm proud of you. It's just not the way we're built. Sometimes I do feel like the dynamic is a little bit like that. We have a government who loves its citizenry like an Asian parent, trying to cut the fruit for us, trying to make sure we're healthy, trying to make sure we are well educated, that we have all of our material needs taken care of. And then perhaps like an Asian parent, we might think, no need to say I love you or they should know, right? They see everything I do, right? They should know. But unfortunately, that's not how it works.
I think you have a few personal experiences with respect to this, right? In terms of your time at the Pioneer Generation Office. Will you maybe speak a bit more about that and how it relates to the idea that there's certainly some population, there's some segments of the population that think that the government has the best interest at heart. But there are large swaths of the population as well which thinks that, there's certain mistrust or certain cynicism about government policy. Maybe you can speak more about that.
So this is, the anecdote I was sharing with you before we started was, so when I worked at the Pioneer Generation Office, which was a really eye-opening experience for a policymaker. And I really every colleague I spoke to, I was like, if you're working on policy, you got to do a ground posting because it will really inform how you write and communicate policy.
Maybe you can tell also what does it actually do? Like what is
the Pioneer Generation Office, which I think is now called the Silver Generation Office.
Right.
At that time, it was started up because the government had created this Pioneer Generation package, right, which was this massive package of healthcare benefits in recognition of the fact that our pioneers, our first generation of Singaporeans, had grown up and worked in a third world country, but they were retiring in a first world country with the costs associated with the first world country. So in recognition of the fact that you certainly wouldn't have enough CPF or savings to pay for medical bills in this kind of society, we want to help you. So they created this huge package of benefits. Now we realized quite quickly that it was healthcare policies are complex. They can be quite technical. It depends on what kind of medication you're using, what kind of particular service you need. Is it like a procedure or is it just a chronic condition checkup? There's all these different things. And it was really hard to communicate, especially because many people in our first generation either didn't speak English or were more comfortable in vernacular dialects or were illiterate. And so a lot of the traditional means of communication, send a letter to the house, put the advertisement at the bus stop, were not reaching the people it was supposed to reach. So in recognition of that, the government started this office, which was our raison d'etre was to go to the ground and really go to people in their homes. Because a lot of pioneers also, if you're wheelchair bound, you might not leave your home very often, and go to people in their homes, knock on doors and say, I'm here to explain to you what this package is. I'm here to make sure that you got your card. I'm here to make sure that you know what you can use this card for so that you can start benefiting from the subsidies as soon as possible. So, we go around, we knock on doors and try to get people to talk to us. That's where I realized how much cynicism there is in the community against the government sometimes, which is, again, they believe the government is competent. The government got integrity, they will arrest you if you're corrupt or whatever it is. But this belief that you have my best interest at heart was much more lacking. So, for example, in many of the homes we visited, there was a government letter drawer, which is just like a drawer that the family has. Every envelope that arrives with the government crest on it just goes into that drawer unopened, and they tuck it away. They don't want to see it. They're like, "Oh, you hear from Zheng Hu is surely a bad news one. I don't want to know." Right? So a lot of letters were not being opened to begin with, and then even in households where they were opening the letters. For example, we had this scheme. Part of the Pioneer Generation scheme was this. I think it was called PG-DAS, the Disability Assistance Scheme, and it was $100 or $200 in cash every month into the Pioneer's bank account. Cash, not a voucher that you could only use for the supermarket, cold hard cash. Spend it on whatever you want into your bank account every single month for the rest of your life if you have certain disabilities. And many of our pioneers, being very aged, have those disabilities. We thought the take-up rate would be really high from the start because it's one of the first times the government is just giving out cash into your bank account, no questions asked, do whatever you like with it. But the take-up rate was really low. So we visited pioneers in their homes, and there was, this uncle I was speaking to, and he's wheelchair bound, and he, can't feed himself. And I was like, Uncle, you can definitely qualify for PG-DAS. The last time we came, we told you about it already, right? 6 months ago. Then how come you don't want to apply? The letter's still here, you never send. Why? And of course, there were some ops policy issues it's actually very difficult for bedridden pioneers, for example, to go get a doctor to certify that they are indeed. So we sorted all those things out. We got the feedback from the ground, PGO, and then we worked with MOH, and we created a program where doctors could visit pioneers in their homes. So we got around some of the ops policy issues. But there was this last thing, which was the psychological disbelief government would give out money. And the uncle said to me, you came and you talked to me the last time. Then I go and I talk to my friends at the kopitiam. Then they say, crazy lah, Zheng Hu will never give you free money one, surely not real. And the strength of his belief in what his friends were saying was so strong that for 6 months he didn't apply, and he lost out on maybe $500 to $1,000 worth of benefits because that cynicism was so strong. And that was a real eye-opener for me because, like I said, young civil servant at the time, then working in government, then everybody just wants to do a good job for Singaporeans. So you're like, why don't they believe us? And it took a lot more kind of reflecting and getting to know the community to understand that. But that cynicism is really there. I think we can't discount it. It's something we have to address.
Do you have a sense, I guess, from where it comes from, the cynicism? Is it from interactions with the government that formed how they see the government even to today?
I don't know where exactly it comes from, but I could imagine some scenarios. I mean, every interaction you have with an authority shapes how you think of them. And in Singapore especially, I think we think of every authority figure or organization as being somehow part of government. We have GLCs, right? So if you have a poor interaction, even with like say DBS Bank or you know, any GLC, even though they are private companies, you're like, oh, it all goes back to government. These are all government people. So down to every stat board, every ministry, and every authority figure, even hospitals might be like, oh, I had a bad experience at this hospital. Now government is so terrible. We have this assumption that any authority figure in the country is like somehow part of government because we have all these GLCs. And so if you have a negative interaction with any one of them, you know, can be any Singapore, DBS, a hospital, whatever it is, you start to associate that with just government. And I think some of our policies are, so there's that interaction point. Then there's also the fact that some of our policies are intrusive, right? I mean, we dictate a lot of restrictions around when and how you can use your CPF savings. It's a mandatory savings scheme. Lots of things are compulsory. I mean, NS is compulsory. EIP and HDB is compulsory. We have a lot of things that people feel like they have to do, and it might not always be what they want to do. And so that can also breed certain level of like unhappiness and the belief that you don't have my best interest at heart because you're not actually letting me do what I want to do. I mean, similar to a kid with an Asian parent, right? Like, why you don't let me study poetry? Restricting me, right? So I think there's that. And I think, you know, you're talking about PM Lee Kuan Yew. I think he was, as a natural orator, he was very good at making people feel that he really, really cared about Singapore, and he was willing to, you know, fight quite literally for the country. I mean, you know, you can lower me into my grave, and if something's wrong with Singapore, I will sit up. And, you know, never fear. You know, we will be a metropolis. The way he spoke, I think people could tell that he really, really cared. And with successive governments where we have to be, in our communication, become more technical, become more informative, probably that feeling has waned a little bit. So I think it's probably a combination of factors, very difficult to address, but I feel like it's such a pity. A long time ago, I think maybe in the days of Blogspot or Twitter or something, I remember posting something. I was a civil servant at the time, and I was feeling so tired because so often we were just getting a lot of complaints, and it was really demoralizing after a while, right? Like, you know, just everyone like hates what we're doing, and like, we're trying, and like just getting lots and lots of complaints, and people were so angry all the time. And you know, we were reading forums, and it's just so angry. And I posted something about how sometimes I think the government needs to give the citizens a hug, and sometimes I think the citizens need to give the government a hug. And yeah, that thought has really always stuck with me, even as I've left, because it's like the government. The civil service, the government wants to do what's right for Singaporeans, but very often that doesn't feel good. Right? The things that we demand or that we ask, and if Singaporeans don't, you know, feel like you're very smart, you're very values driven, fine. But I think you're doing this for you, not for me. I think you want the country to be a certain way, but you're not doing this for me. And that's where that disconnect can come in. And I hope it will be addressed in some way.
And I think this is really important because a very big part of comms in general is that you need to relate to what is the perception of the thing that you're trying to communicate. And in this case, whereby there's a lot of negative perception about whether the government has the citizens' best interests at heart. When you talk about, I think, a lot of sensitive issues, like say immigration, you talk about, you know, let's say CPF, I guess there's the perception that the government's policies in those instances are not necessarily acting with the interest of the citizens' best interest at heart. Which is why I'm very curious in this case. I think you also mentioned on, say, the Modular podcast. And I think a large part of understanding what is the motivation or who is this person that is making those policies actually affect how people perceive it, which is why politicians today, for instance, they are much more candid in terms of, I guess, going on podcasts, whether they're running their own or whether they have their own TikTok account or they go on podcasts to share, I guess, who they really are. I think a large part of that is trying to build trust. And I think you say on your Modular podcast that people don't actually fully appreciate the taxing nature of the work of politicians as well. So I would love to hear your perspective, I think, working with them. And I think why do you think that even though they have, I think, clearly made an effort, I don't think it has gone a long way towards clearing some of those doubts. So, which is why I'll love to hear your perspective.
Oh, no, really? The young Singaporean says that it must be correct. I wanted to, just on that first point, right, in the first half of your question, when you're talking about, are you making these policies with the best interests of citizens at heart? I think actually one way to think about it is the government has to make policies with the best interests of all the citizens at the same time.
Exactly.
Which very often will not be the best interest of a particular citizen in one way.
Exactly.
So, COE is an example. Everyone who drives hates the fact that COE is going up so high. But everyone who lives in Singapore would also hate living in a perpetually congested, polluted country. Mm-hmm. We have the vehicle quota system for a reason, right? And we don't like its outcome. Who likes the ERP when you go through the beep? You know, it's like, it's a death by 1,000 cuts, right? No, everybody hates it. So in that moment, the expensive COE, the $4 ERP is not in this particular person's best interest because it is hindering you in some way, but it is in the entire country's best interest. And that, I think, is the difficulty that civil servants have to navigate. They have to make policies that serve all citizens at the same time. Yep. And it's incredibly difficult to do that. Also, not just right now, but in the long term. We want to have things that are sustainable. Mm-hmm. Very, very difficult to get rid of the pension system. I mean, there are many countries around the world today that are still unable to get rid of the pension system. But you look at the math, and the math doesn't math, right? Especially with a shrinking workforce and things like that. We could do the thing that's right for a particular individual right now living today, or even a whole group of individuals living today, but might be a terrible, terrible thing for an individual living 50 years from now. Our kids, our grandkids. So that, I think, is the difficulty that civil servants face. And I hope for empathy for them. They're trying to policy make for everyone. It's not like a business. Now I do a lot of work with the private sector, and businesses have the privilege of kind of choosing their clientele, choosing their customer base, and say, we're not really interested in this kind of customer segment, so we don't really need to deal with their concerns. We're just going to deal with the concerns of the segment that we want to serve. And civil service doesn't have that luxury. We have to policy make for everybody. And so it has to be fair for a large number of people at the same time, which is really, really hard to do. That's why in policies, we're always talking about trade-offs, right? It's always trade-offs. Very rarely will any policy give you only good things. Always going to be downsides. And actually, the real luxury that we have as Singapore, being, I think, a pretty successful country today with pretty good resources, we sometimes get to choose the problems we have. And that's the greatest luxury of all. Policymaking is just choosing the problems you want to have. In many other countries, you have those problems and you cannot choose your way out of it anymore. So preserving that ability to choose the problems we have, I think, is what's going to be really, really important in the policy space. The second half of your question, can you repeat that?
I think the idea that politicians, for instance, that despite them having the best interests of citizens at heart, right? Of course, it doesn't serve every single. Right. There is still, I think, them putting themselves out there, going on podcasts, running their own TikToks. I mean, sure, there are people that they are convinced because they see them being more authentic. Yeah. But I don't say that that's everyone. So I'm curious about your perspective as to why I think some of this mistrust still persists.
Well, I think...
Is it that they should be more authentic?
No, I mean, I think that many of them are trying. Nobody wants, whether a political leader, a professional in the workplace, anyone, nobody wants to show up and do a bad job. I think they're trying the best, right? I think something that's hard for the average person to understand is the stress of political life, I think, intruding on every part of your life and your family's life. And I think that's one reason why a lot of capable people don't step forward to serve. And I spoke about this a bit on the Modular podcast. It is a hard life. If we as an electorate punish the people who step forward so much, such that it becomes a very, very painful choice for both you and your family to step forward, we will end up only getting the people who step forward because they love the limelight, because that will make it worth it. And when we get into that situation, then I think we might go the way we see a lot of other countries going now. So I understand why Singaporeans get upset. You hear about $1 million salaries, and for the average Singaporean, you're like, that's crazy. Like, why are you earning so much money? we get upset because political office holders, if they live, in private housing or in like nice housing, that feeling that you're somehow enriching yourself by leading Singapore, that feeling is there, and it's completely understandable. The problem is we could slash political salaries. We could require our political leaders to live, in public housing or whatever it is. But the lesson from everywhere else in the world is that a system of kickbacks might develop. A president of a country might only make, a couple $100,000 or whatever it is, but you should find out what they charge in speaking fees for the rest of their life after they leave the presidency. And it almost becomes the position of political office then doesn't become your act of service. It becomes the thing you need to do in order to unlock the better life afterwards. And I don't think any of us want it to get that way in Singapore, right? We want to make it such that, to be honest, if you become a political office holder or a politician, one consideration is, you're going to be much less present in your family life. So I think it's not incorrect that the government wants to pay you such that, your spouse or your family members could leave their jobs and help more with the family life because you're going to be more absent. Things like that. Considerations like that. A lot is said about the MP allowance, but I don't know. I've never been an MP, but from what I've heard, very little of the MP allowance actually goes home with the MP. A lot of it is used for buying food for the volunteers, buying materials for that you need for the work that you're doing, and a lot of it goes back actually into the work that you need to do or for your ground in particular. So it's very, very understandable that Singaporeans kind of look at anyone who is earning so much or seems so distinct, separate, or like far away with suspicion. But you got to ask also, what would the alternative be? And I think it's idealistic to say that if we just removed every benefit and only made it pain, that good people will still step forward, because you still want to be able to provide for your family. You still want to be able to ensure that your kids have a good chance in life, and all of that. The kind of people who will step forward then are the ones who just want the power and are willing to take that pain for the power. And I think that would be very dangerous for us.
I think that's a very important point. And I think on this as well, and I think for Singapore to be able to continue making those hard policy decisions, and whether it's unpopular, it might not be, not resonate with a lot of people. A large part of it is communicating well. And which is why I would love to hear your perspective, whether you've seen moments whereby comms expands what is politically possible, allowing, I think, riskier policy decisions or, I guess, more unpopular policy decisions than it will actually be.
When I look at, so I was listening to this podcast, my ex-boss, Janadas Devan, was giving this interview on Yalabat. And one thing, it was a great interview, I recommend everyone listen to it. And he was really kind of like from the first generation of Singapore, and he was talking about what it was like to live through the race riots and how really, really terrifying it was, because you could die. Someone could die. I think it's something a lot of us who didn't live through that find very hard to understand. My mother used to tell me, she was like, growing up, you have only ever known Majulah Singapura, but growing up, I sang 4 national anthems. I sang the British national anthem, the Japanese national anthem, the Malaysian national anthem, and then finally the Singapore national anthem. And that creates a certain psyche, right? Growing up, about how you think about, will your country still be here in 50 years? It's hard to say. Yeah. So I think that the racial issue of that time, the racial and religious issue at that time, was so existential. I think the government really went out full blast with communication on, we need to be a multiracial society. So even when Lee Kuan Yew was talking about, we'll go from a mudflat to metropolis, it was like a multiracial metropolis. And the comms on that was so consistent and maybe over communicated, like in a good way, that I think only that the fact that it was so communicated so often is what created just enough policy space to do some pretty radical things. Language policy was very radical. EIP, HDB, very radical. even something like national service. I mean, that wasn't directly to do with the race and religious issue, but it was about kind of existential threats. So I think those are examples of things that today we kind of take for granted. EIP is a reality, NS is a reality. But back then, when it didn't exist, can you imagine introducing those things today in a world where this doesn't exist? I mean, it would be earth-shaking, right? So I think that was one example where, Racial Harmony Day, the importance of multiracialism, the importance of religious tolerance and harmony, and enacting laws and everything that protected that, and communicating that so often, and taking every opportunity to do that, creating the GRC system, being like, really, we're going to walk the talk on minority representation and things like that. It created policy space for some radical moves, which I think, while imperfect, I think we can agree has created a largely positive outcome today, where we genuinely have interracial harmony and interreligious harmony in a way where you look around the rest of the world, it seems like a distant dream for many other countries, right? I mean, I love seeing Indian and Malay people celebrating Chinese New Year, right? So I'm half Chinese and half Indian, and at our Chinese New Year gatherings, it's like the United Colors of Benetton. It's fantastic. And also, my Chinese neighbors will ask me about the foods we eat, the festivals we celebrate, and like I have a neighbor who, for her birthday, we hosted dinner and I got pani puri. And she was like, this is amazing. And then this year for her birthday, she's asked for the same thing again. She's like, please, can we get that snack again? It was fantastic. I want to have it again. We're partaking in each other's culture in a very easy manner, right? And anyone our age, it would never occur to us that it could be otherwise. So those very invasive policies, I think, created a largely positive outcome. While imperfect, everything is imperfect, there's always trade-offs, created a largely positive outcome that I think none of us would want to sacrifice today. One point that Janadas made on that podcast was the existential social issue of today, our generation, will actually be the local foreigner divide. And I also think the socioeconomic divides, those are the divides that we're going to have to navigate. And my worry here is that we don't have policy space right now to do radical things about that. I'm not sure whether communication alone can solve the issue, but maybe this is something that has been more difficult to communicate, which has resulted in a lack of policy space. So for example, a lot of the policies that were enacted to address the multiracial, multi-religious issue actually work against our social divides today. So for example, EIP works for race and religion, but HDB is for Singapore citizens and some PRs. You'll never really see foreigners living for long term in HDB. So there's a lack of mixing there. Then you start to get enclaves of like private developments where most of the foreigners will live because that's where they can live, right? School systems, right? You have some of the popular primary schools. Singapore citizens have the first pick, right? So then the children of like PRs or foreigners who are in local primary schools, they tend to be in the same few schools where there's usually spaces. And then there's the whole international school system as well. So we don't have the levers for mixing across this kind of divide today. And can you imagine, like, what would it take for us to be able to intervene? We don't have the policy space to intervene because a lot of things just wouldn't be accepted, right? I mean, back then with the multiracial, multi-religious issue, every community had to sacrifice something for everyone to get along. The Chinese community sacrificed Chinese first education, right? Chinese education, and also the vernacular dialects in favor of Mandarin. The Indian community also gave up a lot of languages, right? So only Tamil was chosen. And there are a lot of non-Tamil speaking Indian communities in Singapore, and that was just a sacrifice that had to be made, right? Across, like the Malay community especially, but also communities of other religions, whether or not you're allowed to wear your religious attire in uniforms and things like that, which remain controversial to this day, right? Everyone had to make sacrifices in order for the whole to get along. If I were to ask that question today about the current divides we face, what sacrifices are we willing to make to enable foreigner local or immigrant local integration and integration between the socioeconomic classes? Would we extend NS to foreigners, right? Bit difficult from a security perspective. Would we allow foreigners to live in HDB? Would we insist that the wealthy give up GCBs so that we can build more HDBs, so that we can have non-Singaporeans living in HDBs as well? I mean, all of these are huge tsunami-like moves, and I'm not sure there would be the appetite for it in society. But if we don't do something, it's just going to get worse. Will we criminalize hate speech against foreigners the way we have criminalized hate speech against ethnic groups? And also we could criminalize foreigner hate speech against locals if we need to make it, equivalent? Would we do those things? Really hard to say. And I think part of the reason is that we are not convinced as a society that we need foreigners. Honestly, if you go back 1 or 2 generations or 3, we're all foreigners, or most of us are, right?
Yeah.
The majority of us are, at least on one side of our families, immigrants to this place. So I don't know if communication can solve this, but I think we saw it work with the multiracial issue, also helped by the fact that it really was an existential issue for us at that time. Can that model still apply to the fissures we're seeing in society today? I'm not sure, but I think it would be a start. I think the government does try to communicate the need for foreigners here, immigrants, migrant labor. I think there are ways to talk about it and to educate, right, broader society about why it's so important. For example, I think now there's a lot more sympathy for migrant workers in Singapore. The COVID pandemic really, I think, opened up many Singaporeans to the situations that our migrant workers live in. And I think we've also realized that we're so dependent on them to help us build our nation, right? And so shouldn't we treat them a little better? There are ways to appeal to the humanity in people. I think there's also the stereotyping, right? Everyone thinks like, oh, there's a white foreigner in Singapore, it's some rich guy who just wants to move here for tax reasons. But a lot of the foreigners I've met in Singapore, and I think this will correspond with a lot of people's experiences, is a lot of them are just here in a regular job, living in a cool country and loving the experience, wanting to afford a flat, wishing that they could buy a flat, trying to apply for citizenship so that they can one day buy a flat. They're more regular people. So maybe there's more we can do there to open people to that. Because I think the xenophobia will be very, very dangerous for us. And also class wars will be very, very dangerous for us. Yeah.
And I think that one important thing here, and Singapore always talks about this, for instance, very contentious, I think, religious/racial issues, whereby the government leaders actually convene community leaders to be able to have a dialogue and to be able to make some form of compromise. And I think that is a manifestation of comms in a way as well, right? How do you get buy-in, and how do you get people, like what you said, for the language policies? How do you get each racial group to give up a certain thing to have English as, the dominant language? Yeah. I think those are things which can only be done because of communication, which is why I'm very curious, like when you're thinking about the role of communications in solving some of these issues, do you see that its role is actually underappreciated or is not understood enough in terms of what it can actually do?
I do think communication is a bit underappreciated. I personally believe that it can achieve a lot, that communication is very powerful. In fact, it's one of the most powerful tools we have. Wait, let me take a moment here because I'm trying to figure out how to say this in a way that's fair to the government. I do think communication is a little underappreciated in the sense that I think it is a lot more powerful than many of us give it credit for. I also think that we also don't want a situation where communication is driving policy. So, for example, in some of the Western liberal democracies, we're talking about now politicians are so aware that they need to be at the top of the news cycle every single day, that they need to communicate something, regardless of whether it's ready or not. So we don't want it to drive. We don't want to let the tail wag the dog, as it were. But I think a broad vision, right, needs to be communicated for people to understand why all of these policy changes are taking place, for people to understand what is the direction we're moving in. So you don't need communication to drive policy, but you do need communication to help people understand what you're trying to achieve through your policies. I talked about this on the Modular podcast a little bit, right? A concrete vision is very, very helpful for people to hang all of to understand why you're doing what you're doing. Like when Lee Kuan Yew talked about from a mudflat to a metropolis, you can see it, right? What is a metropolis? Tall buildings, the skyline, the infrastructure that you have, the services you have access to. And so what did he do? I mean, he created HDB, Jurong Island, so industrialization, MRT network. I mean, all these things are consistent with the promise that he made, which was, I will make this a metropolis. Right? And with PM Goh Chok Tong, when he talks about a Swiss standard of living, again, you can see it, right? You can feel it. You're like, okay, so it's like egalitarian, good social safety net, high quality of life. So the things he did, I think it was him who introduced the vehicle quota system, right, which played a big role in making our air less polluted. HDB upgrading so that everyone has a nicer home, creation of more of the social safety nets today, like Medisave and things like that. And even the parliamentary reforms, I think that he undertook to modernize our political system.
What did he do there?
I believe he introduced GRCs, if I'm not wrong. Maybe not NCMPs, NMPs,
I see.
all those schemes to create more diversity of voices in parliament. I'm not sure about the GRC thing. I'd have to double check that. But I'm pretty sure he created the NMP and NCMP schemes, modernizing Singapore in that way. So with that vision of a Swiss standard of living, you understand why the policies are moving in this direction. With the 3G, I feel like for me, my interpretation is, this concept of a global city in Asia. So no longer a global city that's trying to leapfrog the region, but a global city that is, rooted in Asia. And then this concept of what's a global city, you can see it, right? Like a London, a New York, a Paris, a global player, a city that's significant on the global scale. And so, PM Lee talked about, all the infrastructure mega projects, Jewel, Marina Bay Financial District, Tuas Megaport, all of these huge things that would put us on the map. The integrated resorts, that was also designed to put Singapore on the world map. F1. You could see where all of these policies were moving us towards. And so I think that we will always need that, a vision, an overarching vision that is communicated regularly in different ways, almost so people can just feel where you are going and understand why you're making the policy moves that you're making.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that before this, we were talking about, for instance, I think PM Wong having come into office, the idea is how do you create a new narrative? Because I think that all of those ideas about what Singapore should be, whether it's like Goh Chok Tong, Swiss and All Living, or I guess Lee Kuan Yew, Mark Fletu, Metropolis, those were all things which have very much realized to some extent. Of course, you compare to Swiss, I think some people will say that, okay, maybe Singapore is still not there yet.
We're still so much more hot and humid.
Exactly. But in a lot of ways, I think that those promises have largely been realized. And which is why there needs to be a new form of narrative, a new form of social compact almost, as to how do you create the policy space, because you have this overarching new narrative and new comms to be able to marshal people to make some of these hard policy decisions. And I'd love to hear a new perspective on this in terms of how do you feel, I think in the most recent National Day rally he mentioned, let's say we first, right? Like how do you feel about this new narrative? And do you think that this is strong enough of, I guess, a new narrative to be able to create policy space to make those hard decisions?
So I am not 100% sure that actually we need to remake the social compact completely. It doesn't need to be a completely new narrative. A common thread through all of our generations of government has been about inclusion, has been about making sure that every part of society feels like they're being brought along. And inherent in each of the visions that we talked about, right? First generation, second generation, third generation, the vision was, okay, this is what government will deliver for you. I will deliver a metropolis, I'll deliver a Swiss standard of living, I'll deliver a global city. But implicit in that was also, I need you to meet me halfway. So what are the things you need to do for us to be able to achieve this vision? I will do what I need to do, and I need you to do what you need to do as well. So for Lee Kuan Yew being very clear that you need to take a multiracial approach to things. We can't be a divisive society. We're not going to be a metropolis that way. We need to be willing to industrialize. We need to be willing to take on different types of jobs. We need to be willing to fast track our education, which again, I think language policy came down to that as well, right? Being able to modernize really, really fast is very, very painful in cultural, with the cultural impact it can have. And again, with the second generation, a Swiss standard of living. So what does that mean? You must be willing for us to again, go into certain industries. I think it was in that generation that we decided to become a biomedical hub, right? Yeah. So, okay, we need more doctors. Send your children for STEM. We need more scientists. We need, this is what we need to achieve it. So there's a need from the population to come forward. Also, I need you to support certain, moves in the social safety net direction, right? So we need to support things like Medisave or CPF so that everyone can retire well. So there are these things that the population also needs to do. And the 3G vision, I think, is the same, right? So if we're a global city, there are trade-offs, right? The IRs put us on the world map. We also have to be willing for it to not cause as many social ills as it could. So we got to have some restrictions on Singaporeans gambling. F1 is really exciting for the world and really annoying for a lot of Singaporeans because it's, the roads are closed and everything. But, you watch it on TV and you feel a sense of pride as well. But it comes at a cost. The skills future is a great example. As a global city, we're going to need to continue to be at the cutting edge of whatever kind of economy the world is in right now, which means that we have to be willing to upskill ourselves across our lives.
Yep.
Right? So we need to be willing to go back to school. We need to be willing to change industries. And these are hard things to do. And also, we need to continue to bring up our social safety nets so that everyone can feel brought along. So with We First, I think that it is actually quite consistent. It's a consistent continuation of that message. I think what's interesting is the focus on this part of it. I think in a sense, it is really what Singapore needs because we've taken care of a lot of material needs. In the Maslow hierarchy of needs, almost everyone has shelter, food, water, electricity, education, healthcare. These basic needs are taken care of. And now what is left is like kind of self-actualization as a society. Like what kind of society do we want to be? And I think actually a lot of Singaporeans yearn for a We First kind of society. Like that's why people bemoan the loss of the kampong spirit or the hawker culture. All of those things actually speak to a community culture, like a community spirit that I think we all can tell is precious and we all can tell is fading. Because in any materialistic or capitalistic society, or indeed a meritocratic society where you are judged on your ability to achieve and produce, there is this sense of increased competition with each other rather than camaraderie and companionship. This sense of we have to compete for school places, so it's a zero-sum game. I have to compete with you for this particular job. It's a zero-sum game, and this feeling of heightened competition, I think, leaches into our everyday life and our everyday interactions. I mean, driving in Singapore is famously stressful because people cut each other off, they undercut, they you signal and then like people speed up so that you cannot come to your lane. It's really, really, really common. And a lot of the people doing this are really wonderful people, right? We become different animals on the road somehow. I would actually really love a campaign, actually, just as a side note. I think we should have a national campaign to say like all Singapore drivers, use your hazard lights to say thank you. Because right now, in other countries, when people flash their lights, they're like giving you way or they're saying thank you. Over here, flashing your lights is like a precursor to honking. It's like
irritation.
I'm irritated, right? I would love for there to be a way for us to communicate thanks or apology on the road, which we don't have today. There's the hand, but no one can see the hand, right? It's very hard to see through the glass. If there was a way to be like, oh no, I cut someone off by accident. I didn't mean to do that. Put on your hazards, be like, sorry. Right? I think that the driver in the other car be like, okay, at least he knows. Or to say to a pedestrian, put on your hazards and go. I think the pedestrian would feel like, oh, this is people are treating me with dignity. We want to be treated by others with dignity. And that's actually what this We First thing comes down to. It's about putting the community and your interactions with others as being very important. I have a couple of small concerns about it. One is that I think that the concept is exactly what we need. I worry a bit about the tagline because I worry that if people don't go back and read the NDR speech, it can be taken out of context and We First could start to sound like Singaporeans first, which again, goes back to the fear of like xenophobia. It's not like that's not what's being communicated, but it could be misinterpreted that way. And this, I think, is quite a real concern because, we saw it with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? One reason why there was so much backlash against the Black Lives Matter movement is because they chose the phrase Black Lives Matter, which invited people to say, but white lives matter, blue lives matter, all lives matter. But that's actually not what they were trying to say. What the Black community was trying to say is Black lives matter too. They were trying to say the standard assumption is that white lives matter, blue lives matter, but we as the Black community don't always feel that our lives matter. So Black lives matter too would have been a better tagline, less easy to misinterpret. But because it was easy to misinterpret, the outrage farming could happen, and we saw that on social media, and it became very, very divisive. Whereas I think most Americans of any stripe or color would agree that if you think all lives matter, you would say Black lives matter too. So actually there was a lot of agreement there that was, it was a missed opportunity for agreement.
Yeah.
Right. So I have that small worry about, I would prefer, it's less polished, but I would prefer we before me. Right? Because I think that makes it a bit clearer. And this is, it's not new. Other people have referred to it as we before me, but I like that better because it just says we, meaning everyone who's around me, can I do something for them rather than just something for myself? And I think that is a very nice spirit retreat. My other small concern is I worry that it will be rejected by society because as currently cast, it can sound a bit like this is what we want you to do. Right? Yeah. Remember earlier I talked about every vision has had this element of this is what the government will do to achieve it. And this is what I need you to be willing to do to achieve it as well. We've got to meet each other halfway. We've got to work together. Here, I think the element that's missing is what will government do to help achieve this? And I think it's possible to communicate that, right? So if the vision was something like a kampong nation, right? I think that would resonate. The concept that you want, we're a global city, we're capitalist, meritocracy and all of that, but we are still fundamentally a kampong nation. Like we are all in it together. We recognize we're in it together. And it doesn't matter if you're different from me, you look different, you speak differently, your lifestyle is different from mine. We are still all in it together because we're a kampong. We're one kampong and we're going to help each other succeed. Each other's success is our own success. That feeling, I think that could be something that resonates with a lot of Singaporeans and also would demonstrate the kind of society the government is trying to build through its policies. I mean, things like MediShield Life, universal health insurance, 2 or 3 generations ago would have been unthinkable, right? Things like the Pioneer Generation package, Merdeka, all of those packages, the strengthening of the social safety nets, the upgrading of like the kinds of flats we have, the public transport system we have, all of this, the investing in the social goods, all of that speaks to the government actually trying to create a we first nation or a kampong nation, right? Where we are all in it together. So we're going to have strong social safety nets. We're also going to try to help each other achieve. Or it could be a city of good neighbors. Everyone wants to have good neighbors. You have good neighbors, like your life, just the quality of your life increases. So, I'm very lucky. I have good neighbors, right? So my kids always have kids to play with, or like their kids always, can come to my place, or if one of us is not home and need to receive the delivery, or the red mart came late or whatever, and we need to help each other out, we do that. It's a neighbor who, if they bake bread, they might give me half a loaf. If they bought a big bunch of bananas, they might give, so there's this very nice feeling. And as a result, I don't ever want to move because I love my neighbors, right? If we could have that feeling in our country, I mean, how amazing would it be? Where when you walk out your door, you have this sense that any person I interact with is going to, as a default, treat me with kindness, dignity, compassion, friendliness, and not with cynicism or suspicion. I think that could be really powerful. That could be an aspiration that I think many Singaporeans could get behind. We all want that feeling. It's why shows like Cheers or Friends are so eternal and they become the comfort watching experience for so many people, because everyone wants that. Everyone wants that community. People who are like, I'm here for you. And I as a default, I'm going to just, be friendly with you and trust that you're going to do the right thing. I remember one time I was driving, and I wasn't driving very often at that time. And so I scraped somebody's car in a car park, and I was like, oh my gosh, I was so stressed about it. It was a Mercedes. It's going to be very expensive. And I didn't, I was a bit worried about finances at the time. So I was really, really stressed. And I left a note being like, I'm so sorry that I scraped your car. This is my number, and, we'll sort it out. And I drive home and I'm shaking. And in the end, it could have been a much worse accident, right? But, I was freaking out, much younger then. And I'll never forget the response from this couple. So it was I think it was a lady and her husband. So they got in touch with me and they were like, thanks for leaving a note. A lot of people wouldn't have left a note. And I was like, oh, that didn't actually occur to me. Of course I would want to leave a note because I would hate for that to happen to me. And they were like, because you left a note, we kind of want to work with you on this. So we won't send it to back to the dealer, where the repair would be very, very expensive because they would have to replace every single thing. They don't repair, right? They're like, we'll send it to our mechanic. And he generally can repair stuff quite well, so the bill should be much lower. And I was so grateful. I was so grateful. And then the mechanic came back and messaged me and was like, oh, the lamp, there's a one line on the front lamp, and I'm going to need to replace it because I can't buff that out.
Right.
He's like, I can buff it out and it'll be almost gone, but it will not be good as new. So I need to replace it. And that's going to be, it was like, I don't know, say like $2,000 or something. And I was like, oh my gosh. So I messaged the couple and I said, the mechanic has told me this, but he said he can buff it almost out. Would you be willing for him to buff it almost out? And then I give you $1,000 in cash, right?
Yeah.
Rather than pay $2,000 for this new headlamp. And this couple said, we don't want to make money off you. If he says he can buff it out until it's almost good enough, that's good enough for us.
Oh, that's very nice.
And I was floored because I had just had this stereotype in my head about every Singaporean driver kind of being nasty and like, oh, you scratched me, I'm going to I'm going to milk this for all it's worth. I'm going to repair every single thing about my car and like, may you pay for it. And it just wasn't true. And that interaction has stayed with me for so many years because it was just a kindness that these people showed to someone who they'd never even met in the flesh.
Yeah.
This is all on WhatsApp, right? And that is the kind of community we want to have. if all of our interactions were kind of like that or like had that as the tenor, how much happier would we be as a country? So I think this aspiration of a kampong nation or a city of good neighbors could be very compelling to people. And it might help to create the policy space to do things that enable that, right? Like the strengthening of our social safety nets, or reminding all of us that we need to be united in times of crisis. One reason I'm very encouraged about this, why I think it can really work, this iterative version of we first, right, is going back to the pandemic. So that same report that I mentioned, the Pew research report, one amazing statistic was one of the survey questions was, I got the vaccination because, I thought it was blank about being a good city. Like, what was the reason? 93% of Singaporeans said that they got the vaccination because they thought it was either important or very important to be a good citizen.
I see.
To be a good member of the community. Not because they didn't want to get sick. It was because they didn't want to get other people sick. And also with the mask mandate, I don't know if you remember, but the most effective call for the mask mandate was not wear a mask so you don't get sick. It was wear a mask so the uncle and auntie next to you don't get sick. Because it actually prevents other people from getting sick. It's like, rather than yourself. So this statistic, by the way, was like, of all the countries polled, it was like far and away, like no other country came even close to that
number?
that reason. I did it because I wanted to be a good member of my community, a responsible member of my community, I think it was. And to me, there's so much potential there.
Yeah.
We want to do right by each other.
Yeah.
We just have to be put in a policy construct that allows that to happen. But again, what sacrifices are we willing to make? Does this change how we want to allocate primary school places so it feels less competitive? Or even secondary school places so it feels less competitive? Are we willing to randomize something so that it feels less zero-sum but at the same time less meritocratic? What are we willing to sacrifice to enable this kind of vision? That's a question.
I think that this is really interesting because I think looking back at Singapore's past, for instance, the reason why there was that togetherness, and I think when you mentioned, for instance, COVID, when you have a crisis, it actually unites people. And my perspective on this is that we have not spent enough time and effort telling people about the actual vulnerabilities, like being very transparent about it in terms of what Singapore actually faces. For instance, the whole Ukraine-Russia crisis, right? Energy prices going up across the board. In Singapore, it translates to electricity bills going up, right? But there is a communication lessons in there, in a sense of being able to tell people that this is who Singapore is, right? Which is that we are always dependent on global trade. And we are always dependent on almost geopolitical, I guess, any kind of conflicts. We cannot escape from that. And that becoming a form of unification for the country. And I'm very curious then, in this case, do you feel that Singapore has done enough to narrate its vulnerabilities? Because I think previously when we were talking about this, we talk about, water, right? Singapore's always very aware about our vulnerability with respect to any time Malaysia can turn off the tap, right? And in primary school, in secondary school, for instance, there was like rationing exercises, right? How do you, reduce water? Of course, I mean, today it gels with the whole environmental movement. But I think back then it was geopolitical. So do you think that actually goes some way towards creating an identity whereby I think part of the reason why people feel that they know better or they deserve, let's say, XYZ, is because Singapore feels so prosperous and we feel almost invulnerable to some extent. When Singaporeans go to ASEAN countries, like Singaporeans feel, okay, Singapore is, as a society, more prosperous than those other societies. And it isn't necessarily because of like the goodness of Singaporeans, right? Because of very specific policies, decisions that Singapore has taken. But in not sharing those vulnerabilities as to how Singapore is actually vulnerable, I think we allow that complacency to sit. And which is why I would love to hear your perspective.
It's interesting to hear that because sometimes the other kind of feedback I get sometimes is, the government shouldn't fearmonger so much, always like so negative about we are a small city, but we are a tiny little speck in the middle of the sea, right? So a few thoughts. One is, I think it will always be important for us to communicate our vulnerabilities, but it's difficult to do so. One is because you say it too often, people start to be like, why are it's again, going back to the Asian parent analogy, it's the Asian parent telling the kid, boy, be careful, out there got people want to take your money, you better zip up your backpack and all that. And the kid is like, oh, whatever, just stop. You're so paranoid. Right? So there's this, if you're overwrought about it, people will not resonate with it. It helps when it's shown rather than told. The Russia-Ukraine war is a good example. I think, it should be alarming to all of us that a large country has just been allowed to invade a small country because it wanted to. And also that the impact it's had on the prices of things and things that affect us. So it's helpful when it's shown rather than told. In fact, I've been speaking to some friends recently, and a couple of them have voluntarily extended their NS obligation because of the Russia-Ukraine war, which I thought was really interesting and heartening. I've spoken to some female friends who also, when we talk about it, we're all much more open to the concept of female conscription in the future. And I think that there is the looking at global events, seeing it, right? And that helps to drive the message home. More so than if the government is constantly being like, you got to be careful out there. So there's one. It's difficult to constantly communicate insecurity because at some point you might stop getting taken seriously. It's helpful for it to be shown rather than told. So what we can do is amplify our education on making sure that everybody can see what is being shown. It's front of mind for everyone, and explaining why that's important for us, explaining that that's why prices are going up, that's why we're concerned on the world stage and things like that. The second thing is, while I, again, agree that it will always be important to communicate our vulnerabilities, it's also difficult to do so too publicly because we're not the only ones listening, right? For example, when civil servants, I can't go into details, but sometimes we go into negotiations with, say, a company that's providing a product or service, and we're like, why are you charging so much? Whereas in other countries, you're charging much less. And the response is sometimes we read your newspapers and we know that your citizens will not accept this not being available here. So pony up. Right? And that gives us actually very little negotiating room because they read our newspapers, they see the forum letters, they're like, Singaporeans will not accept it if you don't have this here. So we can charge you what we want because we know you have the money to pay. So you're kind of held at ransom. If you communicate too much about our vulnerability, you also kind of educate the world on our fissures, the cracks that can be exploited. And then you run the risk that those things will be exploited. So on that note, I think it's always going to be really important that we have kind of small group targeted grassroots engagements. My experience at PGO was that actually this, going to the community, speaking to families one-on-one, addressing their concerns, and talking in small groups, it's incredibly resource intensive, but I think it's really, really important creating that education. And the third thing is sometimes when you only talk about the negative, it's demoralizing, which is why it needs to be complemented with a positive vision. Yes. So I think Lee Kuan Yew was able to talk about water being existential because he was also saying, but I will build you into a successful city. And so we always need to be able to balance that. There has to be the positive and the negative because if you leave a vacuum in the positive, it will get filled with people appealing to baser instincts. You got to make sure that there's enough appeal to better instincts to avoid people always appealing to baser instincts. But I always felt like, maybe I am too far on the side of we got to communicate our vulnerabilities more because as a civil servant, ex-civil servant, it is an occupational hazard. It's what you're thinking about all the time. And you also, you see it much more vividly because you see what other countries are saying to you, what they're trying to do to you, where the risks are. But again, some of it can't be communicated openly because then it becomes public to the world as well. So it's not easy.
Which is why I guess this leads into a question I had. If you had, I guess, control the government apparatus, how will you change the way that the government does its comms?
Oh, wow.
I know this is a big question.
In my practice now, so in my consulting work now, I work with leaders and organizations on how to communicate internally for leaders, externally as well, but always in a very human way. So I don't really do much like PR, branding, marketing. I'm not. There are better companies for that. But what we work on is how to communicate in a way that connects to the heart of a person while communicating the difficult message you need to communicate. So it can be, you need to communicate through a crisis or through change, restructuring, or for an organization that does very technical work and they need other people beyond the technical field to understand why this work is important. Whose lives does it change? Whose lives does it save? Right? I think that human element, communicating in a way that touches the heart of somebody else, is always important, no matter who you are, no matter what you do. And I think as a government, I would like us to do more of that. Because I think for the government that we have now, it will come from a sincere place. It will not be I'm just trying to make you feel good so that you vote for me. It's like I said, the three things, right? We're very good at talking about our competence and our integrity, but how do I make you feel like I really have your best interest at heart without being disingenuous? It's really, really hard. It's a lot easier said than done. But I think we could put more effort into that.
Are there missed opportunities, like specific examples that come to mind? Maybe one question I had is that, what is one truth about government comms that the public rarely appreciates?
It's harder to do than you think. Government is so large. And sometimes the work any one part of government does, first of all, it's already very hard to maintain a picture of what's happening across government. I think Singaporeans sometimes think of government as this one monolithic, like the character from like some alien character where it's like a hive mind, right? And like everybody knows what everyone is doing, and it's all like every single announcement is like strategically like, trying to make this point or that point for all the various. It's really hard to keep track of what all parts of government are doing because it's a huge piece of machinery. It's many, many pieces of machinery that are just all trying to do their job as well as they can. So coordination is really, really difficult. Also, getting things technically right while also simple enough to understand is really difficult. Yeah. So I do have a lot of empathy for when we go to policy announcements, and now as a citizen, like if I feel confused about it, it's because sometimes it is very technical and difficult to communicate. So there's more we can do with like simplifying policy, which will make it easier to communicate. But we also don't want to sacrifice the ability to make policy well, right? Which requires some targeted intervention sometimes. And the other thing is, I think sometimes if you wonder why the heart is not coming across or coming through, it's, again, a government is just people, right? Yep. And so you have the civil servant writing the press release or the political office holder like making the announcement. And it could just be that their intention is to inform you, just to give you as much information as they can because they want you to know everything. And in trying to do that, something's got to give, right? So it might lose simplicity, it might lose a sense of heart, it might sound very technical, but they're doing what they think is right. And like I said, if I could change something, it would be, trying to bring that sense of care out a little bit more. But I think when you're in the service, there's also this sense of that's not relevant. Oh. The fact that I care so much is not what's relevant to the community. What's relevant to the community is, how is this going to affect me? What do I need to do? How do I get the information I need? How do I get the help I need? The fact that I care might almost be like selfish to focus on communicating that, because that's a me issue. It's not a them issue. So I guess in the same way that Asian parents are like, I want to make sure they have everything they need, and then I can die knowing I did everything right for my kids. For the civil servants who I think care a lot about their work, the fact that they care, to them, maybe that's not what's relevant for the community that they're trying to communicate with. I disagree, especially now that I'm on the outside. I am a part of that community, but having been on the inside, there may be this feeling that, the fact that I care is not, they don't care about that. What they care about is how this affects them. There's also governance exhaustion. I think every civil servant, I don't know if this applies to political leaders as well, but sometimes when you feel like you're under siege because you get so many complaints, like I talked about that time in my career where I was feeling very worn out because it was just, I just felt like there was so much hatred for government and I didn't understand why, and I didn't know what to do about it. I think a lot of people in the service can feel that way, and it creates a sense of exhaustion. And at some point, it solidifies or it hardens into defensiveness. So if you've ever had an interaction with like a part of the service, whether it's a stat board or like a, whatever it is, on the ground office or someone in a ministry, where you felt like the response was immediately defensive, right? So like, I remember a friend was relating this story. She was asking town council or HDB or someone, I'm not sure who, what are the plans for the community garden that were being planned? And the response was, can you be sure what you want to do is going to be accepted by all the residents? And it was a lot of caveats and a lot of defensiveness straight away. And she was like, why are they communicating this way? But I think that just comes down to the person at the end of the line who received that note and was replying to it was probably just feeling under siege, right? And it doesn't excuse the fact that they should have responded differently, but it can help me understand why they did. And so I guess if I wanted people to know a few things about what it's like inside government, don't discount the existence of exhaustion. Don't discount how far a bit of kindness can go, right? In your interactions with the member of government. And if you don't feel the care in the communication, it could simply be because they feel like that's not what's important for you, even though I disagree with that.
How do you get them to communicate more with their heart then? Is this something that people, I mean, when you're working with leaders, I must imagine that they also...
The good thing about the clients that I work with is that I think all of them actually recognize from the get-go that they want to communicate from the heart, which is why they engage my services.
Exactly, which is why I'm very
So
curious.
the starting point is already like,
aligned.
oh, we have this life-saving medication and we want people to understand why it's about its safety and also about what it cannot do, so that people are very clear on it, and or like with the leader communicating about layoffs or the need for change. I think that the sense there is that, oh, my care is very relevant because as say like a medical manufacturer, the care that I have in this product is very relevant to you because you have to trust that it will not poison you. For a leader of a company, the trust is the care is very relevant because people they want a leader who cares for them. And if they feel like the leadership doesn't care for them, they could easily leave and go elsewhere, and they don't want that to happen. So for them, I think the care is very relevant. It's very clear to them that the care is relevant. I don't know why it's different in government. It feels a bit different. Maybe it's the sense of service. Again, you're not following me, so I don't need to convince you that I care about you. I'm trying to serve you. Right? I'm trying to do something that's good for you, and that's what's relevant. So the orientation is a little bit different.
Interesting. Does this, I guess, change the methodology that you adopt when you work with, I guess, public service leaders versus more commercial leaders?
The methodologies are always a bit different. I mean, even in thinking about like how this is not directly related to communication, but it was just a thought I was having because I was working with some government agencies on like how to communicate the need for transformation. And I realized that when I work with the private sector, communicating the need for transformation is always about a burning platform, right? That's the traditional transformation image. Your platform is burning, you're being outcompeted. What are you going to do to save yourself? But in government, actually, the image cannot be a burning platform. It's not compelling. It's not, it doesn't resonate because the government's platform is not burning. The government is not going to be outcompeted. There is no alternative, MOH, right? There's no alternative MOE. You will continue to exist. The need for you will continue to exist. But you are finding it harder to do work because maybe you have a sinking platform, overloaded platform. You are doing more and more things and it's weighing you down. Right? And so the way you need to think about transformation maybe is not, like completely revamping the products and services we provide, which might be the way a private company addresses it. But for government, it's about how do we streamline what we're doing? How do we get rid of the things that are no longer relevant? So that's just an example of how the mindset has to be completely different because the nature of your existence is completely different. You're not in a competitive environment, but you also have a duty to the entire population, not just a segment of the customer base, right? So it would be the same with communication. Right? How do you demonstrate that this is an act of service rather than just the whims of a powerful government? So the starting point also would be a bit different.
So I think that when you look at other countries, for instance, right, is there anything that comes to mind for you in terms of other countries doing very, very well when they communicate with their citizens or when they do comms in general?
In the current geopolitical or in the current global environment, I see a lot more negative examples than positive ones.
Maybe even negative examples.
And I guess it's because that's what makes the news. That's what makes the news. I'm sure there's a lot of really good examples of fantastic communication that are not making the news because it's not causing controversy.
I see.
But just, harkening back to what we were talking about earlier, like the fact that news cycles are so short, and because political cycles are also increasingly short, and even between elections, we're seeing national leaders get ousted, changed, support for parties like drastically changing. So there's this need to constantly fill the space of the headlines. And if your opponent is outrage farming, you've got to outrage farm too. And that's what ends up pushing both political sides to extremes and causing the collapse of the center. So unfortunately, but I tend to see more negative examples. Honestly, while I will always, as someone who cares about human communication, I will always have my thoughts on like, what we can do better as a government, or what we can do better in Singapore. But by and large, I'm very grateful for what we have, especially given everything else in the world right now.
For sure.
And maybe that is something we need to talk more about. I think we don't talk enough about. It's kind of like, that you get told, gratitude journaling is good for your soul, right?
Yeah.
Like, it will change your outlook. So I find that to be true.
Yeah.
Like when I do take a moment to like write down 3 things a day that I was grateful for, I got to see on the bus or whatever, like, even little things, it reminds me that there are always good things happening to me.
For sure.
And when I remember that there's always good things happening to me, it makes me happy with my life. So maybe we need to do a bit more of that at a national level. Gratitude journaling for the things that we have. I mean, maybe we're not happy about X, but there's like, so much to be grateful for about Y. Like, I mean, we live it every day. Just walking as a woman, walking down the street late at night and feeling completely safe. That doesn't happen most places in the world. And it's something I would gratitude journal on a social level, right? Or like just access to public housing. We're not happy with many aspects of it, times, resale prices, but widespread access to public housing, everyone knowing that it is always there for you if you need it. Even if you are not in public housing, if your circumstances change, you can always, as a Singaporean citizen, apply for it. That kind of the peace of mind that creates, something to be really grateful for.
For sure.
I had a friend from Hong Kong who her mind was just blown by the existence of public housing here compared to what they have to deal with there. So lots of things to be grateful for. And maybe that's what we need to communicate more of in the national consciousness.
And I think for the very last question, I think we still have about 15 minutes, so you still have time to expand on it. What's your most tough love opinion for Singapore? What Singapore desperately needs, but no one is really going to like it?
I think, and this goes back to one of my earlier answers, I think we desperately need to mend the divide between locals and foreigners and between the haves and haves less. And no one's going to like it because I think it will take a lot of communication that people are not going to like, policy changes that people are not going to like. But I really do think we need to do it because I think that is the existential social issue of our age. As a small open global city that is also populated with a largely immigrant community from its founding, we have always thrived on being diverse. We have always thrived on being open. And we need to continue doing that. We could close our doors and throw every foreigner out like the way some other countries are doing. I don't think that will be good for us. And I think if any Singaporean, if we sat down and talked through like what that would look like and what would happen, I think we would all come to that same conclusion eventually, that would not be good for the long term. I think we need to have less visible inequality, or we need to somehow shift towards more visible egalitarianism. Right now, the fact that there's a lot of like conspicuous consumption or conspicuous wealth, and it naturally invites comparison, and comparison is the thief of joy. So we do need to, I think, do things in that direction, but I'm not sure what would be acceptable. Can you imagine laws or policies that force integration in these two realms the way we forced integration among races and religions? Means it's gonna be, it will be interesting. And it will probably feel very radical, and there will probably be a lot of social rejection. But that's my tough love take of what I think Singapore needs. I think it's also part of becoming truly a kampong nation and a city of good neighbors, because we need to just fundamentally accept the people who are here and treat them right and treat them with dignity. And that applies to everyone who's migrant workers, domestic helpers, foreign talent, everyone. The old, the young, the rich, the poor, everyone.
Actually, I'm very curious. What do you, because I think you mentioned that it's going to be very, very difficult to even do it, right? Like, do you think that there's something, like any budding ideas that you feel can actually realize something like this? Because to be able to communicate something like that, or to be able to enact something like that, you need for people to understand, why are we doing this? And I think that the government in general has done a lot to try to communicate how important the foreigners are to the vibrancy of the Singapore economy. But do you feel that there's more that could be done?
I actually think for this, it doesn't necessarily need to be, or shouldn't necessarily be, top-down communication. I think there need to be more bottom-up opportunities, whether curated by government or not, for people to interact across those lines, which is really what happened with the racial and religious issues, right? So it wasn't just the government saying it is important for all of us to accept each other.
Yeah.
It was the fact that you're living side by side. It's the fact that you're all serving NS together. It's the fact that you're all going to the same schools and speaking the same language with each other. When you get to know a person at a human level, it naturally creates a level of empathy and understanding that just wouldn't otherwise be there for people of that group. I mean, even for the repeal of 377A, I think what Pink Dot accomplished was they were not trying to farm outrage, right? They were not outrage farming. They were actually trying to expand people's interactions with the gay community, the LGBT community, and say, we're just people too.
Yep.
And I want to get to know you as a person. I want you to get to know me as a person. And once you get to know me as a person, you will care about my lived experience in the way I care about your lived experience, right? And that is the powerful thing. I think that is what moved the social needle to allow acceptance, right? Broad social acceptance for the repeal of 377A. It took us a long time to get there, but I'm glad we did, because and the way we got there was through farming love and acceptance, right? Through interactions, having a huge picnic and just everybody come, right? Meet each other, hang out with each other, make friends. And obviously that wasn't the only space in which like that was happening, but it was one example of that. I think we need to do that with between locals and foreigners, and between the wealthy and the less wealthy, so that people can see that we're all just human beings with different problems, and we're all just trying to make our way through our one fleeting and precious life. Right? You have to have more interaction opportunities to understand why the foreigner is here. I mean, so I've met some foreigners who like are here because they're so grateful for the safety and security of this country, because it's very different from the country that they came from, even if it's a developed country, Western country. Or who are just so enamored by the school system here, they want to raise their kids here. It's people are here for very human reasons. Or it could be they're here because they are starting this really interesting company, or they are doing this interesting work, and in interacting with their Singaporean colleagues, a lot of that is spreading and it's benefiting us, but a lot of that is not visible unless you actually get to know people. And they need to be getting to know each other in non-competitive environments. So having foreigners in the workplace doesn't help this, because you might feel like you're in competition with them. So I don't know, I think what we did before was where you live, where you go to school, how you spend your time, public spaces. So we got to move on some of those things, but I don't know what there's an appetite for. And it's the same with the wealthy and the less wealthy, right? If you have all wealthy people kind of just eating in the fine dining restaurants and never going to a hawker center, then that's not going to be good for society either. And I think one thing that's really great is that every Singaporean, regardless of their means, we all eat at hawker centers and coffee shops, and it's like a universal thing that we are all like, no, this is very, very precious. Don't ever take my my coffee shop uncle who knows my Desi Kosong order away from me. Those things need to be built on.
Yes.
We need to have more common spaces where everyone can be. So more truly public spaces. I really like the fact that we've reserved some of our best pieces of land for public spaces. But I think more can be done to make it even more welcoming to everyone. For example, Marina Bay, anyone can go take a walk around it and be like, wow, look at the lights and but there are many people I speak to who don't feel like they are welcome there, because they're like, I'm not the PMET, I don't really go into the CBD, I feel awkward. We need to do more to bring all Singaporeans into every public space so that we can just all be there together, meeting each other in a non-competitive setting. How to do that? Very difficult. I have to think about it.
And with that, thank you so much for coming on, Sheila.
No, thanks for having me.